Hello everybody, my name is Fortefyre and welcome to episode 4 of the Ready Go Gaming Show. Today, we're going to be talking about Nintendo. It's going to be a long one, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this shit, because it's going to be great. We have a lot of people who worked on this video. Some of them are kind of a secret, so you're just going to have to sit back and watch and find out who else is part of this video. But the two retro streamers who are helping me today are BreathoftheLyle and YougotMarin. Our first guest is BreathoftheLyle, and he is a retro streamer. He's more of a retro variety streamer. He does whatever he wants, whenever he can. He's also had to do like myself, so it gets kind of tough to sit down, make a video like this, and stream and really have a family all at the same time. So because of that, I'm stoked to have him here. He's a great friend of the community, and he's a lover of Zelda. He actually really loves Zelda, and I can't blame him. It's a fucking awesome series. Our second guest today is YougotMarin. YougotMarin is a Canadian retro variety streamer who I think mostly does either retro achievements or other stuff. It's all retro, and she's a lovable member of the retro community. She's a DGDS streamer. She's fucking awesome, and I love her to death, and I'm so glad that she as well was able to help out with this video. So that being said, sit back, relax, because we're going to talk about Nintendo. Oh wait, I gotta do something first. I gotta read this because this is actually kind of important. Here we go. Firstly, everything we are talking about is the property of Nintendo. Nintendo owns the rights to the copyrighted materials. This is not and never will be a monetized video. So there, but just in case people get antsy, let's talk some fair use. The fair use of a United States copyright includes commentary, search engines, criticism, research, reporting, scholarship, and more importantly, parody. Fair use provides the legal, unlicensed use, unlicensed citation, incorporation of copyrighted material in another author's work under a 4-factor test. What I'm saying is, Nintendo, please don't sue me. And realistically, if Nintendo had an issue with this video, I'd have no problem with them putting ads all over it. Please, make that be the first thing you do before you try to copyright strike this video. Because a lot of us came together to work on this, and hopefully it's a big educational tool for a lot of people. But that being said, let's go ahead and get into the video. Enjoy, guys. Before we get started, let's take a look at a brief historical recap for Nintendo. So Nintendo Playing Card Co. Limited as a company originated in 1889, based in Kyoto, which focused more on playing cards and was led by a guy named Fusajiro Yamauchi. These Hanafuda cards were really ornate in design, and the market was booming. The business went strong all the way into 1963 when they began to branch into other markets to increase their income. This would lead to adventures in the taxi business, food companies, TV networks, and even love hotels. Later that year, Nintendo would drop the playing card title and become solely known as Nintendo Co. The previous ventures eventually failed, and the direction of the company headed to making toys. It was at this time that Gunpei Yokoi was hired as a maintenance engineer. Much like Adrian Carmack from id, this guy was an innovator. He was a forward thinker with ambitious ideas which really appealed to investors. Chasing the coattails of Bandai and Tomy, Nintendo decided to focus on family entertainment and try their hand at a relatively new market, the video game industry. Nintendo made its first real executive decision as a game company by trying to get rights to the Magnavox Odyssey, but even after succeeding in that, they decided that making their own take on the concept was more appropriate. This would lead to the Color TV games. So fun fact, the guy who created the case for the Color TV games was a man known only as Shigeru Miyamoto. In the 70s, Nintendo jumped to the arcades with games such as Donkey Kong and EVR Race. Yokoi wanted to create handheld games as well, and drew inspiration from the early Game & Watch series, courtesy of some random guy playing on a calculator. This is also about the time that Nintendo-style D-pad was created and patented. Nintendo as a company has stood proud among their competitors, even getting into a console war with Sega during the 80s as well as the 90s. The rest is simply history.
While Nintendo was working on the Color TV game series, they designed something known as Game & Watch. Put it this way, if it wasn't for Game & Watch, Tiger Electronics wouldn't be a thing. The Game & Watch games were simplistic in nature and eventually would serve as the inspiration for the Game Boy handheld console, but we'll get to that in a second. In 1982, Nintendo made something called the Advanced Video System, or AVS, which was a home console prototype that looked like a gaming computer but had some pretty innovative features. It had a unique controller and accessories, but unfortunately never passed the prototype stage due to the video game crash in 1983. But it led to a chain of events that made Nintendo one of the greatest companies of all time. This home console that would eventually be created was called the Family Computer, or Famicom for short. In the initial run, it was plagued with a short-circuiting chip that almost caused Nintendo to give up on the game industry altogether. It cost them $500,000. In modern time, that's roughly $1.3 million. Nintendo needed a way to sell the game internationally to make up for this loss, and tried to cut a deal with Atari to get the game system circulating in the US. Coleco and Atari went head-to-head to get the license, with Coleco narrowly emerging the victor. Eventually, Atari did receive the green light to port it on the PC, but by then it was too late. Around this time, the infamous video game crash of 1983 occurred due to an oversaturated market. In other words, Nintendo definitely dodged a speeding bullet. The rest of the world wouldn't know the NES until 1985, right around the time that many of the heavy-hitting franchises we know and love today were finally given the chance to shine throughout the world. Over time, the Famicom and NES both would have expansions to the basic console. In terms of the Famicom, there were plenty of peripherals released, such as the Famicom Disk System as well as the Famicom keyboard. The NES in particular had tons of peripherals, many of which were third-party items, such as the track and field floor pad or Mattel's Power Glove. We aren't going to cover them all here today, but just know there are a crap ton. Interestingly enough, this is a trend that has carried on to this very day. The impact of this initial system would be massive, leading to a bunch of clones being made as well, especially since the NES and Famicom didn't reach certain countries. Another quirk that made the game system so successful, especially during the crash of 1983, is that not just anyone could make a game for the system. They had to earn this seal of approval. They also went as far as to limit the number of games a particular company could release to avoid oversaturation. Konami in particular was known to work around this rule by creating multiple studios, such as Ultra, which made Sid Meier's Pirates as well as Metal Gear and Snake's Revenge. The NES as a system has definitely stood the test of time. Even in modern years, people still show interest in these classics by speedrunning Nintendo games and even losing their minds over the NES classic. Needless to say, this console is still alive and kicking in retro communities despite the support being fully shut down in 2007 after almost 62 million units were sold.
In 1989, the NES was still going somewhat strong and the Game & Watch was kind of becoming outdated. Alright, it was super outdated. Gunpei Yokoi noticed this and used many of the concepts for the original Game Boy. This puke green brick of fun was the turning point for the handheld gaming. It ate batteries like cheesy poofs, and if you wanted to play in the dark, forget that, light not included. The Game Boy literally had no competition. The Milton Bradley Microvision, which was the direct competitor, would literally rot away while the Game Boy was capable of surviving explosions. Hopping back to the console world, Nintendo noticed that there was a drastic change coming up where 8-bit was being pushed to the back burner for the new and improved 16-bit era. The first console to be released in this time frame would be the NEC and Hudson Soft joint venture PC engine localized in America as the TurboGrafx-16. But to be honest, the NEC didn't do a fantastic job at advertising, and Nintendo knew that they could capitalize on it to some capacity. Another thing to consider is that Sega was talking mad shiz about Nintendo, saying their Sega Genesis did what Nintendo don't. This led to a huge back and forth rivalry, and Nintendo released their answer to the Genesis and Mega Drive in 1990 called the Super Famicom. America would see the Super Nintendo in 1991, the same year the Neo Geo came out, and Europe would see it in 1992. The more you know, right? The Super Famicom and the SNES were both huge successes in their regions, and they had probably one of the most unique abilities of any systems from that generation of gaming. The SNES had the Super FX chip used in Star Fox and Mode 7, which was used in F-Zero, Super Mario Kart, and a few other games. And if you wanted to play your Game Boy games on the SNES, you totally could thanks to the Super Game Boy. Nintendo even partnered with a TV broadcasting company to create the Satellivision, but it failed after a few years. The only other noteworthy thing to say about the SNES is that as the 90s rolled along, there was a huge want to make CD-based games, and who else was better to reach out to than Sony? Originally, the joint venture was supposed to be called the Nintendo PlayStation, and it would have likely been a huge success had Nintendo not broken their creed and allowed Philips to use their franchises on their CDI. Yes, we're looking at you, Faces of Evil.
Hey, excuse me!
Due to this, Sony said no very loudly in Japanese and walked out of the room, leading to the creation of the Sony PlayStation eventually. Again, just like the NES, there was a limited release SNES Classic run that made collectors lose their mind, mainly because it had some really expensive individual games on there. All in all, 49.1 million units of the SNES were sold worldwide. 23.35 million of those would be in the United States and 17.17 would be in Japan, selling less than the NES.
Around the mid to late 90s, the game industry had a bunch of different consoles, each with their own unique spin. For example, the 3DO company had the 3DO. Original, huh? Atari was still trying to be the major contender with their Jaguar, but it was lacking. Sega tried to beat out the success of the Genesis with the Sega Saturn, and as we mentioned earlier, Sony took the Nintendo PlayStation idea and ran with it, releasing the PlayStation in 1994. Nintendo, wishing to beat out the PlayStation, created the Nintendo 64. I actually own 2 of these because I enjoy it so much, and I wanted to play the Japanese releases on true hardware. The Nintendo 64 was a commercial hit, selling a ton of copies the first day it was released. This would lead to the creation of Nintendo America in an effort to localize Nintendo 64 games more effectively and economically, but the downfall was that they were still super strict on who they allowed to participate in the creation of games, much like their NES era of gaming, and because of this, they allowed many powerhouse series to jump to the PS1 inadvertently, not only because of Nintendo's policies, but because CDs as a medium were easier and cheaper to make. Much like every system that came before, Nintendo attempted a secondary add-on for the Nintendo 64 called the Disk Drive, or Double D. To be honest, it never really left Japan. In the handheld spectrum, the Game Boy was still beating the competitors, and Gunpei Yokoi created the next release, the Game Boy Pocket, as a parting gift to Nintendo, of which he resigned from 1996. He would eventually go on to create something known as the Wonder Swan, and in that same year, Pokemon would be created. Sadly, in 1997, the father of Metroid and the Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi, passed away in a tragic car accident at the age of 56. Gunpei's legacy is still apparent to this day, as the next major handheld gaming device by Nintendo would be the Game Boy Color, followed by the GBA. The GBA, also known as the Game Boy Advance, was a drastically different approach to the handheld. Instead of having to buy third-person peripherals, consumers were able to enjoy a backlit gaming system with amazing sound capabilities. The games also looked pretty cool with a rectangular shape as opposed to the clunky square games the Game Boy used. The next major release in the home console market for the Nintendo would be the Nintendo GameCube. I actually don't own this, I feel really sad. But basically, it's a compact square-shaped console that ironically played discs. Really small discs, which was a massive departure from the traditional formula for Nintendo. The system was incredible, the graphics were phenomenal for the time, and the controller is oftentimes considered to be the greatest video game controller of all time. If only Microsoft had learned that with their Xbox controller. Up until now, Nintendo was mostly all about administrative changes and releasing fantastic games. It wouldn't be until 2004 that they again rocked the industry with their technical innovations, the DS and the Wii.
From 2004 onwards, Nintendo seemed mainly focused with stagnating where it was graphically, and instead applied energy towards innovation. The first major change would be the introduction of the Nintendo DS, the new standard for Nintendo-based handheld gaming. The DS had it all, somehow improving even more on its design from the previous Game Boy, the SP. Much like its predecessor, the DS was backlit and folded in half, allowing for portability of the system. Additionally, the DS had 2 LCD touchscreens, a microphone, and had the capabilities to incorporate wireless connectivity. The games were also adorably tiny, slightly larger than a quarter. One important aspect of the DS was that consumers also had replayability with their investment, as the DS was backwards compatible with the GBA. Consumers were ready for Nintendo to come back strong to combat the powerhouse systems, namely Microsoft's Xbox 360 and Sony's PS3, but at the time there was no insight to what Nintendo was planning to do. This all changed in 2005's E3 Summit, where the concept of the Nintendo Revolution was revealed. The Revolution had a unique controller, wireless in nature, which allowed for what seemed to be impossible. Shigeru Miyamoto, as goofy as he always was, wildly promoted this new system, and in 2006 the Nintendo Revolution was released as the Nintendo Wii. The Wii was an innovation at the time due to its wireless capabilities. Wireless internet was fully supported, and the console was backwards compatible with the GameCube. If you lifted the top cover, you'd see a bay for 4 GameCube controllers as well as 2 memory card slots. The Wii also allowed for people of all ages to enjoy various retro games courtesy of the Virtual Console. I'm talking NES all the way to N64 with Turbo Graphics, Commodore 64, and pretty much everything in between. The Wii Remote, or Wiimote as it was dubbed by the gaming community, received a big update with the inclusion of the Wii Motion Plus, which matched player motions in an almost 1-to-1 ratio. The Wii was a massive commercial success, mainly because Nintendo knew who their target demographic was and how to draw them in. The console sold over 101 million units worldwide. During the rise of the Wii, Nintendo continued to expand on the DS line as well, creating the DS Lite, DSi, as well as the DSi XL. All of these were simply cosmetic changes to the original platform. For example, the DS Lite was, well, lighter. The DSi had a camera on the outside and internet capability was more fine-tuned and promoted multimedia such as photography, videography, and music. Eventually, one key function that was removed starting with the DSi series was the ability to play Game Boy Advance games. But that didn't stop its momentum because many of these games could eventually be purchased through the Virtual Console service.
The Wii was the heavy hitter for a long time in terms of how the Nintendo interacted with the home console market. The Wii would eventually evolve into the Wii U, but between that, the Wii Family Edition was released. Not much changed outside of the backwards compatibility. The Wii U was a drastically different beast, boasting a massive controller that had a pretty decently large screen on it. Also, the graphics were pretty good for what it was. It confused a large amount of the community because they didn't understand if the console was a standalone or just an addition to the Wii, and it didn't help that the Wii U played Wii games almost acting as a standalone Wii. But all in all, it had the same components as the new upgrades to the DS line, the 3DS, meaning that concepts such as cameras, accelerometers, gyroscopes, and near-field communications, NFC for short, were all prevalent and integrated into the libraries. In fact, the new 3DS was capable of a variance of 3D imagery, which also could be turned off for people who were sensitive to the new depth of imagery. Then they made the screen a bit bigger with the 3DS XL and even released a handheld that removed all of the 3D capabilities called the 2DS, but it looked like a door wedge with playability, so many people mocked it. But it's the perfect system for kids. As always, Nintendo continued to show new concepts, but none were as impressive as the Nintendo Switch. It's a hybrid console that you can take and play on the go, and is capable of 4K. I never thought I would say the words 4K and Nintendo in the same sentence. That's insane. Breath of the Wild, please and thank you. All in all, the story of Nintendo was the story of consistent innovation that went somewhere. Nintendo had the formula to exceed expectations every single step of the way. They as a company cared enough to pinpoint their target demographics and deliver non-stop since 1889, something many companies cannot claim. With pure imagination and innovation, Nintendo, hands down, is one of the greatest video game companies of all time.
Well, it's that time in the video where we talk about some of the franchises that Nintendo released over the years. Please note that in order to make this list, it has to follow a strict rule, and that is that the game has to be both developed and published by Nintendo to some capacity at some point during the game's lifespan. Also, the top 3 will be listed at the end, so stick around. 1080. 1080 is a snowboard racing game that was released in 1998, which ironically was the second snowboarding game released that year. The other was Twisted Edge Extreme Snowboarding by Midway Games. I actually owned it, and it kinda sucked. I think I played 1080 in those nifty demo cabinets back in the day, and the first entry in the 1080 series was looked at as a playable game that people traditionally enjoyed, and because of this, Nintendo released a sequel with 1080 Avalanche. But by the time it was released, SSX was definitely leading the subgenre, and many people considered it a subpar follow-up limited due to bugs and frame rate issues.
Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing is a community simulation game where you play a protagonist in a village inhabited by animals, with you as the only human. The first worldwide release was in 2001 on the GameCube, with the original game released only in Japan for the N64. The whole concept of the game was originally planned around the Nintendo 64 disk drive, mainly because the game revolved around the idea of being sociable. But that idea died with the disk drive. While the system itself faded away, the series they were planning did not. Animal Crossing was a commercial success, and is oftentimes considered to be one of the greatest GameCube titles of all time. Nintendo opted to take the sequel to the handheld market with the release of Animal Crossing Wild World in 2005, which kept the same concepts and offered little change from its predecessor. That being said, the game was still loved, selling just over 325,000 copies during the first week of sales. When the Wii came out, many people cried out for another main console Animal Crossing game, and their pleas were heard with Animal Crossing City Folk in 2008. The game was once again mostly the same framework, but with new technology such as the nunchuck and Wiimote. There are also options to play minigames in a more interactive format. The most recent contemporary entry in the series was Animal Crossing New Leaf in 2012, which was met with generally positive reviews. 32.4 million units were sold. And Tom Nook continues to make a royal killing from loan sharking.
Art Academy. This game has a ridiculously long title, so here we go. Art Academy. Learn painting and drawing techniques with step-by-step training. And the title kind of explains the overall concept of the game. It teaches you how to draw. The interesting thing is that the game started out as a lesson-by-lesson based idea through DSiWare, that when suddenly in 2010 the entire game was released in full. Many people loved it for its calming nature, and a few sequels were released, such as Art Academy Sketchpad for the Wii U in 2013, and a few spin-offs, such as Disney and Pokemon-related games.
Balloon Fight. Balloon Fight is one of the go-to console classics of the NES and Famicom. The game is simple. You control a balloon fighter with 2 balloons attached to your helmet. Using the controls and relying on momentum, it's your job to stay afloat and take out enemy balloon fighters who also have balloons attached to them. Overall, there's been 16 versions and ports collectively, which still maintain the simplicity and magic of the first release. That, and the music, is also really, really catchy.
Brain Age. Brain Age is a long-running series from Nintendo that aims to improve mental aptitude by various means, focusing on the work of Ryuta Kawashima. Fun fact, I had this game on the Nintendo DS, but I gave it to my grandmother because she loved one of the mini-games on it, Sudoku. The first game was released in 2005, and the US saw it a year later. It consisted of a bunch of tests such as math questions, Stroop tests, and incorporates most, if not all, of the technological abilities of the DS itself. It's a pretty awesome game, to be honest, and an excellent time killer. The sequel came out in 2007 and continued with the same format with a few new mini-games. The game was well received, despite some quirks that consumers felt were unnecessary, but overall the game was a success. The most recent entry in the main series was the Brain Age Concentration Training, and by then the game series was kind of played out and it was viewed as an average entry in the series. A spin-off called Brain Age Express was released in between 2 and Concentration Training that was just a small addition to the series. Card Hero. Card Hero, formerly known as Trade and Battle Card Hero, is a game that is a simple card-based RPG that Intelligent Systems helped out with. It's a super simple game that people traditionally enjoy and has a specific rule set, as is the norm with card-based RPGs. If you are a Game Boy Color traditionalist, then check it out too.
Diagasso Band Brothers. This is one of the few music-related games that Nintendo developed and published as a launch title for the Nintendo DS. The only problem was that it was released only for Japanese consumers. Basically, it consisted of a bunch of songs that were relative to Japan to include pop culture references in Japan as well as classical music. It's pretty interesting because it's different than what American consumers were used to with DJ Hero, Rock Band, and Guitar Hero hanging around. A sequel was created in 2008 in Japan and 2010 in Europe, again, no US release. This time the instruments were bumped up to 60 instruments, allowing the consumer to create music and remix known tunes with different instruments, meaning the combinations were virtually unlimited.
Excite series. Giving me all the old classics, huh, Fort? Well, let's talk about the start of this exciting series, Excite Bike. Excite Bike is another critically acclaimed landmark title for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It's pretty much just a motocross racing game where the rider has to balance over big hills while also maintaining speed and watching to make sure your engine doesn't overheat. If you crash, you have to frantically button mash to return to your bike. Speedrunners love this game, by the way. As a launch title, it saw overwhelming success, which led Nintendo to spawn a sequel in 2000, which was developed by Left Field Productions and known as Excitebike 64. It fit the bill for many of the 3D motocross and racing games for the time, so it didn't really stand out, but people still loved it. Nintendo had a penchant for releasing OLED titles under a new brand while retaining key concepts, so when the Wii came out, Nintendo decided to rebrand Excitebike as Excite Truck, with the idea of focusing on monster trucks instead. It was one of the first Wii games to be released, and even won awards at E3. Many of the key elements remain, such as having to balance the vehicle and avoiding overheating. Excitebots would be the next entry in the series, where focus shifted to animal-themed robot vehicles which had a few minigames. While it was fairly successful, it was overshadowed by other games during the era that were leading the industry, such as Mario Kart and F-Zero. The most recent entry in the series was Excitebike World Rally, which was a reimagining of the original NES game in 1984 and supported online playability.
Famicom Tantai Club Kieta Kokeisha. So that game basically translates to Famicom Detective Club The Missing Heir, and it's a Japanese exclusive adventure game that was created for the Famicom Disk System in 1988. It's a Japanese exclusive that has a deep plot and tons of characters. It's command style, meaning that you have to choose what you want to do from a menu as opposed to freely exploring, but that was the norm for the time. Basically, you play as a detective and investigate the death of a friend. That's it. The sequel Part 2 Ishiro Nitatsu Shoujo, The Girl Who Stands Behind, is the direct sequel to the text-based adventure that once again was released on the Famicom Disk System, although, like its predecessor, it was ported to other systems over the course of time. Obviously, the remakes looked more aesthetically pleasing, but for a text adventure of the time, both games are pretty nifty.
F-Zero. When you think of racing games for Nintendo, you probably think of Mario Kart, but that's for the casual gamer who wants to enjoy their experience. If you're a serious racing fan, don't mind death as a potential outcome, and get a rush from moving at the speed of light, then F-Zero is the game series for you. Personally, I only remember a few in the series, but it does have a rich history as a Nintendo IP. The first game was simply called F-Zero, and it was released in 1990. I vaguely remember the artwork of the logo. It looked like cold steel melting due to the intense speed of people flying to their doom. F-Zero was a pioneer in a couple of aspects, such as one of the original uses of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7, where it's almost exclusively used. It was highly successful, and with highly successful IPs there are bound to be sequels. In fact, the sequel didn't take long to come out after the N64 was created, with F-Zero X being released in 1998. This time, the game speed was heavily increased, actually providing consumers a challenge, as well as introducing 26 new vehicles, each with their own unique aspects and characteristics. The game was simply amazing, the music was memorable, especially Mute City, who doesn't know that one, and despite a few graphical limitations, people simply adored the game. The next entry would be a step down in priority for Nintendo with the release of F-Zero Maximum Velocity for the Game Boy Advance. The game was decent in development and was given favorable reviews, mainly for its take on the graphics, which were more difficult to render to the capability of the N64 and SNES. In 2003, Nintendo dropped the bombshell that was F-Zero GX for the GameCube. This game was pretty awesome, and it was the first F-Zero game for me in the series, though I'm not gonna lie, I was pretty terrible at it. With 30 racers and new and improved graphics courtesy of the enhanced Super Monkey Ball based engine, which we can thank Sega for, this game marked the first commercial partnership with Sega, setting the framework for many games to come. GX was considered one of the greatest racing games of all time. Surely given the success of GX, Nintendo would continue down the path, right? Yeah, not so much. That same year, Nintendo released F-Zero GP Legend for GBA, developed by Suzak Inc. That company went bankrupt, so you can probably figure out the direction this one's heading. GP Legend played almost exactly like the Super Nintendo F-Zero, but don't let that be a bad thing. People love this game, and it's definitely still worth playing. Following the same hope to develop the game for handheld consumers, F-Zero Climax was released exclusively in Japan for the Game Boy Advance in 2004, and would be the final entry into the series at the time. It's one of the best looking though for the handhelds. 5 million units were sold collectively.
Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem was talked about briefly in episode 2 of the Ready Go Gaming Show because it was Nintendo's take on the tactical RPG subgenre. To be honest, not a lot of people knew about this game until Marth and Roy were introduced into Super Smash Bros. Melee, and once the public interest was there, Nintendo answered the call. But let's focus on the older Japanese releases first. The first Fire Emblem game in the series was Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light. Aesthetically, it looked very similar to the title set used by Square Enix for Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, but this game came out a few years after those. As a tactical RPG or simulation RPG in Japan, you play as Marth, growing his army and following scenarios that lead you on a quest across Arcania. It's excessively linear and it's not too bad. Unfortunately, the game was not a commercial success, but despite the financial losses and utter failure of the game, other developers took note of how the mechanics worked, serving as an inspiration for other critically acclaimed tactical RPG titles, such as Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy Tactics, and the entire Disgaea series. If you really want to play this one, it's strongly suggested that you play the remake, known as Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon on the DS. It's a spectacular reimagining of the game, and it's just better in every way, shape, and form. But returning to the series' roots, there was a sequel called Fire Emblem Gaiden, released 2 years after the first entry, and this time it takes place on Valencia, with Alm and Celica being the pivotal characters. It was slightly better than the predecessor, but again it didn't really fit in. It just felt off for consumers. In fact, it was so off that many of the mechanics in the game were scrapped for future releases. But again, if you want to play it, play the DS remake Fire Emblem Echoes Shadow of Valencia. It's better. If you can't tell by now, when Nintendo mucks something up, they just remake it. It makes everyone feel better, but if you aren't confused by now, oh boy, you just wait. The third game in the series was called Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem. It was released on the Super Famicom, and guess what? The first part of the game is a goddamn remake of the first game, with the second part being a totally unique experience. You can't see it right now, but I have a really grumpy face when reading this because Fire Emblem screwed the pooch so often in the early years. They could have easily led the charge in the 90s, but they didn't. Also, this game was released for the Satellaview, which, if you aren't familiar with that, it's a satellite TV attachment for the Super Famicom that would allow you to play games over a satellite connection in timed TV blocks. It was a cool concept, shitty application, and it didn't last long. Oh, and they remade this one for the DS in 2010, but only for Japan! You can't make this shit up, people. The next game in the series was Fire Emblem Genealogy of the Holy War. It was a Super Famicom game, Japanese only release, it looked pretty, and to be honest, it probably was one of the better ones too. It sold so many copies in Japan and people actually enjoyed it. Thankfully, no remakes were made, so now that my blood pressure is lowered, I'm gonna let Marin take over this one.
Don't worry, buddy, I got you. The next entry in the main Fire Emblem series would be Thrakia 776. That's right, we're going with the Japanese pronunciation. It served as a direct sequel to the Genealogy of the Holy War. Again, they retained the same aesthetic style and gameplay, and sales reflected that Nintendo had finally found the necessary formula that would pull in consumers more and more. Interestingly enough, this game was offered first with a Nintendo Power Flash cartridge, which was kind of like a disk drive expansion where games were put on cards, much like the Hue cards used by the TurboGrafx 16. Sadly, this didn't last long, as it died with the Satellaview. With the next release, the series would make its infamous jump straight to the Game Boy Advance where it belonged. This game, known as The Binding Blade, set the direction for the series as we know it, with over 345,000 units sold. This game in particular would be the game that inspired Nintendo to include Marth and Roy in Super Smash Bros. Melee. As BreathoftheLyle said, the public interest for these virtually unknown characters was astonishing. Nintendo even said, screw it, why not? And in 2003, Fire Emblem was released on the GBA. For many people, myself included, this would be the introduction to the series, and what a great trip down the rabbit hole it was. Honestly, when I first bought it, I couldn't put it down for a good day and a half afterwards. Forty might not like tactical RPGs, but this game has the honor of being the 6th best reviewed GBA title during its release. For new players, it bridged the gap by explaining the game's mechanics in a way that was easy to understand, while not being overly complicated or holding the player's hand, and the sales definitely reflected that. 2 years later, Sacred Stones was released for the same system. It was well received for its storyline, but received criticism for how similar it was to the previous game, and being made too easy with the addition of the world map. Eventually, Fire Emblem got a new original title for the 3DS in 2012 with Fire Emblem Awakening, which breathed life into the series and set the foundation for the triple threat that was the Fire Emblem Fates trilogy, released also for the 3DS in 2015. Over 10 million units have been sold over the course of this franchise, each of them holding the hype, magic, and equal parts frustration and satisfaction within those tiny little cartridges. To think, it was all because Nintendo decided to share the series with the rest of the world with that fateful 2003 release. All in all, this is one of my favorite series of all time, and I look forward to seeing what crazy glorified chess game Nintendo and Intelligent Systems gives us next.
Fossil Fighters. This game was a joint venture between 4 companies, one of which was Nintendo SPD. The others were Red Entertainment, M2, and ArtDink. Hee hee. Basically, you play as a kid who finds fossils and uses the DNA to bring them back to... Wait, this is Jurassic Park. No, wait, it's Pokemon. What the hell? This is Jurasimon. Anyway, the plot is usually kind of heavy and was generally well received. Imagine Jurassic Park, but you fight them. It has a manga spin-off, and eventually 2 more games were released, but Pokemon always stood above the series.
Game & Watch. I'm not going to go into great detail about the Game & Watch series, just know that it was inspired by a guy who was messing around on a calculator, and a Nintendo rep said, "Hi!" and made LCD handheld games. There are literally as many Game & Watch games as Tiger Electronics games, but for many people, this was an economic option that offered endless hours of entertainment. I personally had a Game Boy Color game that was called the Game & Watch Gallery that offered a contemporary spin on the old classics and also allowed you to play them in the original format. Mr. Game & Watch is even a character in the Smash series. All of his moves are based on physical Game & Watch releases, so interesting illusions indeed. 43.4 million units have been sold to date.
Kid Icarus. One of the original series released for the NES, Kid Icarus was one of the original platformers for Nintendo while it was overshadowed by another platformer, but we'll get to that later. Kid Icarus was immensely popular not only for its gameplay elements but also for its catchy title theme. The game is simple in nature, but there's a little bit of history that is kind of interesting. You see, in the late 80s, Nintendo wanted to create an action game, which would have been Kid Icarus, but instead was called Metroid. These two games share many elements, likely because the same developers worked on them. Now there's a fun fact you may not have known. To be honest, the Kid Icarus series was kind of left in the dust when compared to the other IPs. The entire series only yielded 3 mainstream titles, with Kid Icarus Uprising being the most recent release, only on the 3DS. Series protagonists Pit and Palutena, along with a copy clone Dark Pit, appeared in the Wii U and Nintendo 3DS versions of Super Smash Bros., and they'll be returning in the Nintendo Switch version of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate.
Kirby. We all know Kirby, but did you know that it technically fails to meet this list because of one simple fact? It wasn't solely developed and published by Nintendo. Instead, HAL Laboratory was the team that developed most of the games. But there are a few games in the Kirby library that Nintendo did create, such as Kirby's Dream Course, a miniature golf game that HAL made jointly with Nintendo. It's a cute cult classic, and it originally started as one of those Satellaview games, but in the end, Nintendo decided a standalone was appropriate. Another off-the-wall game would be Kirby's Block Ball, which is a sort of breakout clone of Tilt and Tumble. A puzzle game which was already awesome because it had an accelerometer built into it. All in all, very few of the Kirby games were developed by Nintendo. Even though Kirby is somewhat still considered a franchise, the most recent game that even had Nintendo development on it was the Dream Collection, which was actually an anthology with a few new extras. Don't worry, we'll definitely cover HAL in a future episode. The Kirby franchise as a whole has roughly 36.5 million units under its belt. But remember, that's mostly due to HAL.
Metroid. Ah, Metroid. There's something magical about the simplicity of this game series, whether it's the phenomenal jumps, the smooth storyline, or OMGs, it's a woman! Seriously, people were confused when they first saw Samus as a woman. In fact, the screen is from the first Metroid game released in 1986. In order to get there, you had to beat the game in under 5 hours. The game was phenomenal and is definitely a classic on the NES, but Samus was more than just a cool character. Samus empowered women all across the world. She represented a form of gender equality in her own way, without even realizing it. Anywho, while Metroid was on the NES, the sequel was a Game Boy game, and speaking of Game Boy games, if we fast forward, the first entry was remade in 2004 and known as Metroid Zero Mission, and the sequel to the original was also a Game Boy game, and Metroid 2 was remade into a 3DS game. Oh gosh, it's happening again. The remakes! Nah, I'm just kidding. The remakes were super solid. In terms of games, many of us actually physically remember from our childhood, if you were about 20 to 30 years old, would be the next major console entry, Super Metroid. Super Metroid was massively appealing and was a hugely successful game. It's one of the must-have titles on the SNES alongside Donkey Kong Country and Chrono Trigger. Real talk, Fusion would be the next game returning to the GBA, and then Metroid Other M was the final major entry in the main storyline released in 2010 on the Wii. But while the main storyline has somewhat stagnated within the last decade, there were plenty of spin-offs for you to sink your teeth into, such as the Prime series, which yielded 3 games and 5 spin-offs of the spin-offs. Overall, Metroid is a staple of Nintendo and sold roughly 17.44 million copies, and spawning the Metroidvania subgenre. NES Remix. The NES Remix series is an interesting one. What they do is take a bunch of Nintendo classics like Balloon Fight, Donkey Kong, Mario Brothers, The Legend of Zelda, and many other games that make Nintendo what it is, and take snippets of levels from those games and remix them into mini-games with special challenges built in. There's hundreds of them. It's actually ridiculously fun. There's only been 3 games between the Wii U and the 3DS, so check them out. It's a nice collection that really brings home a lot of memories.
Nintendogs. This is hands down the best series on the Nintendo DS, period effing dot. End episode! No, seriously, this game brought tons of joy to many individuals and also showcased the technological capabilities for the DS all in one faithful package. Literally, because Nintendogs is about raising a dog. For those of us who grew up with Tamagotchi, this was an awesome addition to the Nintendo library. I personally had a Shiba Inu and a Husky, and oh my gosh, I really want to buy a DS just to play it again. You could teach your faithful companion tricks, feed them, take them for walks, let them compete for cash. It was just an awesome experience. There were a few different versions of the game too, kind of like Pokemon Blue, Red, and Green. If I remember right, there were like 3 different versions, Dachshund, Lab, and Chihuahua. I personally had the Lab version. There was a sequel that included cats, but it didn't have the same magic as before, but it's still cool. 28.25 million copies were sold.
Pikmin. Pikmin is a weird game about multitasking. Like start to finish, it's a weird game. It's an odd combination of puzzles, strategic moments, and action, all while involving platforming. It's just so strange. You play as Olimar, a captain from Hocotate. I have no clue how to pronounce this, so Hocotate, tomato. The game is still weird. The Pikmin are little creatures you befriend, and they help you solve puzzles and stuff. Since the creation of the series, it was highly successful, and 3 games have been created. In 2017, another entry was made for the 3DS, departing from the traditionally console-based game. 5 million units were sold.
Pilot Wings. Pilot Wings as a series is Nintendo's take on the flight simulator genre. It's a really super simple concept, and it's super fun. Check it out if you get the chance. It started as a game for the Super Nintendo with different lighter-than-air vehicles and unique challenges, especially using the Mode 7 capabilities. It received a boost with Pilot Wings 64, which was a launch title for the console but unfortunately wasn't nearly as successful as the first game. Over time, elements of Pilot Wings would be incorporated into Wii Sports Resort, eventually leading to Pilot Wings Resort in 2011 for the 3DS.
Punch-Out! Do you like watching boxing? Do you like punching people in the face? Do you like punching people in the face as a human guy that potentially violates the rules of boxing by being a massively different weight class than the people he's fighting? Then play some Punch-Out! Punch-Out is the take on boxing by Nintendo, and it's an all-American, worldwide, awesome boxing game that's seen 9 different versions. The first and third entries were arcade games, while the second was a Game & Watch exclusive. Arm wrestling would be a spin-off in the arcades as well, and was the final arcade game that Nintendo would release. The game many of us know from our childhood would be the NES release of Punch-Out, as well as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Like many games created by Nintendo, it was definitely a classic and met critical acclaim. Did you know that there was supposed to be a game released by Nintendo where you fought Mike Tyson in outer space, fighting aliens along the way instead of goofy humans? It was called Power Punch 2, and after Nintendo refused to make it, ASC Games made it anyway. The last few games were released on SNES, Wii, and the WiiWare channel.
Puzzle League. This is a run-of-the-mill puzzle game. There were 5 games, of which the first was Tetris Attack. I remember seeing this in Blockbuster as a kid, but I never played it. Mainly the Pokemon version, but oh well.
Rhythm Tengoku. Rhythm Tengoku is a rhythm game series developed and published by Nintendo in 2006 and was literally the last game developed by Nintendo for the Game Boy Advance. It plays a lot like WarioWare and has nifty approaches to minigames, but it wasn't too popular. But once you beat it, meaning that replayability was near non-existent. But that didn't stop Nintendo. Nothing can stop Nintendo. And Rhythm Heaven was released 2 years later. Again, it played exactly the same with the same concepts and as such received the same exact public response. Overall, there were 3 sequels generated from the original concept.
Sheriff. Sheriff, aka Bandito, was an early arcade game made by Nintendo in 1979. Fort played this on his Arcade Anomalies segment, and according to him,
Yeah, that game fucking sucks!
and there you have it. This was a weird one, as it had an 8-way joystick that featured a really abhorrent time delay. Many people didn't enjoy that, which led to it being somewhat unpopular against many of the great 70s era arcade games. On the flip side though, here's a fun fact that puts a more positive spin on this early Nintendo game. Shigeru Miyamoto did the artwork for this game. It predated Donkey Kong, which would come out 2 years later, and in a sense was the foot in the door for Nintendo in the arcade spectrum.
Sin and Punishment. I'm not gonna lie, I'm all about shoot 'em ups. I like vertical shoot 'em ups, I like horizontal shoot 'em ups. And this game is awesome, and I feel really bad because I've never actually played it. Nor have I really dived into many games that Treasure worked on. For those of you who are like,
Who the fuck is Treasure? I've never heard of Treasure. Is someone gonna tell me?
sure will. Treasure is a well-known game company that brought us treasures, pun totally intended, such as Gunstar Heroes, Radiant Silvergun, Dynamite Heady, and Alien Soldier. Basically, they are pretty fucking awesome. Sin and Punishment is a railgunner/shooting gallery game that is set during a dystopian future, and you play as a guy trying to fight a massive cohort of genetically created aliens that were supposed to solve the food crisis, and yeah, it's a weird one. It's one of the few Nintendo-created titles that never crossed the pond, and the only commercial Western release was through ROMs or the Wii Virtual Console. It was never commercially successful, but I gotta check it out.
Space Fever. Ever played Space Invaders? Then you've played Space Fever. Next game. Splatoon. Splatoon is probably one of the more well-known contemporary competitive titles released from Nintendo. If you go to Twitch, I guarantee that you will see a ridiculous amount of people playing either Splatoon 1 or 2. Real talk, this is the premier first-person shooter IP from Nintendo. It shocked the world and pooped on Ubisoft's ZombiU. Overall, the sales for Splatoon 1 exceeded 4.93 million copies worldwide, and the sequel was just as successful. It's an award-winning series and a heavy contender to many of the other franchises released not only by Nintendo, but other companies as well.
Star Tropics. Star Tropics is an action-adventure game released in 1990 that was never intended to be released outside of Japan. In fact, it was backwards from the usual formula, as Star Tropics was never even released in Japan. How about them apples? The game plays like a standard 2D RPG, though bear in mind this was a loose term at this point in Nintendo's life. At the time, even though it's billed as an action-adventure game and is kind of in the same style as The Legend of Zelda, the game had different mechanics. It also had unique accessories that came with it. For those who lucked out and bought the game new as opposed to having to rent an incomplete copy, there was a letter that needed to be submerged in water which would reveal a code necessary to advance the plot. Don't worry though, if you didn't have the code, you could read Nintendo Power or call the Powerline hotline. Though these didn't survive long enough to see the Virtual Console release, Nintendo was kind enough to put the code into the virtual manual. Though by this time, the internet had made the story of the secret letter fairly well known anyway. All in all, this is a cult classic on the NES that spawned a sequel in 1994 called Zoda's Revenge.
Star Fox. Oh my Lanta, where do I begin? Star Fox is a rail shooter featuring an anthropomorphic team of shooty boys named Fox McCloud, Falco Lombardi, Peppy Hare, and Slippy Toad. You fly your R-Wings through the Lilat system shooting Andross's evil baddies that are invading Corneria and Venom. Not gonna lie though, Star Fox on the SNES was a unique approach to the genre and some people find it hard to get used to. But it's really fun, and the music is banging. Fun fact, the game was the first to use what was known as the Super FX graphics chip, which allowed for those really nifty 3D polygons to be rendered and flow smoothly. For those who weren't aware of the original SNES title, there's no excuse not to know the first release sequel, Star Fox 64. Without a doubt, Star Fox 64 is considered to be one of the greatest games of all time, an honor that many Nintendo franchises are capable of claiming. But holy snap, this game included the Rumble Pack and was an overall great experience with multiple paths and phenomenal graphics. This game set the standard for Star Fox and even saw a 3DS remake. Then this happened. Seriously, this happened. Star Fox Adventures. Now, I can't knock it too hard. The issue I have is that the series was known for being a rail shooter, and then to jump to 3D action, adventure, beat-em-up, shooter. Like, why? Star Fox was so good. Anyway, Star Fox Adventures was made by Rare and Nintendo, who made a bunch of games together and was the norm for Nintendo with third-party developers. And it's a third-person game as an adventure mode. Don't worry, the elements of Star Fox are still kind of there, not really, but primary focus in terms of creative development was aimed at the adventure mode. People loved it, people hated it, but oh well. The next game would be Star Fox Assault, and Nintendo returned to the skeleton of what made Star Fox successful, but the game fell short again when it came to making Fox Run. 3 more games would be released in the series, with the most recent being the coveted Star Fox 2, which was never previously released. But don't worry, you can play it on the SNES Classic if you're lucky enough to find one of those bad boys.
Steel Diver. This one is a submarine simulation game which I've never even heard of, but they worked with Vide for it, Vini Vidi Vici, I don't fucking know. The sequel was free to play, and all in all the series was somewhat positive. Style Savvy. Want to get in touch with your inner fashionista? Play this game, I guess. It's just a fashion game. Somehow Nintendo SPD wanted to develop it and it made 3 sequels. Honestly, it seems like a filler franchise.
Tomodachi. Tomodachi Collection, not to be confused with Tamagotchi, is a life simulation game exclusive to Japan for the Nintendo DS. Basically, you have loose control of your Mii as it goes throughout the day doing normal everyday stuff, such as interacting with other Miis and going on outings. Eventually, it sleeps and you can interact with your Mii's dreams. It's basically The Sims without the application. It spawned a sequel called Tomodachi Life in 2013, which is more successful than its predecessor, and it was made available for gamers worldwide. Check it out if you want to see Nintendo's take on The Sims. There was also a role-playing spin-off released for 3DS in 2016 called Miitopia, which retains some of the same life sim elements. These games are fun, if not slightly quirky and repetitive.
The Wars series. A lot of people cherish a game series known as Advance Wars, which is a turn-based strategy series, and if you're younger than that, you probably have heard of Battalion Wars. The truth is, the Wars series has been around since the Famicom days, and the first game released was Famicom Wars. Basically, you control one of two teams, the Blue Moon or Red Star, and fulfill scenarios that revolve around the teams. All in all, that's the general pretense of the entire franchise. The first was only released in Japan, but soon the series took a direction towards the Game Boy with Game Boy Wars in 1990, which spawned 3 more sequels unique to Japan again. In fact, America wouldn't see any of the Wars series games until Advanced Wars, conveniently placed on the Game Boy Advance. The world loved the game. It was a phenomenal handheld game and wasn't too complex. The series set off a chain reaction that resulted in 3 more games before Kuju Entertainment took over for the GameCube series Battalion Wars.
Wave Race. This famous franchise started on the Game Boy of all places, and is a fairly simple game where you race through the water on a jet ski. It was capable of using the link cable if you wanted to play with friends, and was a predecessor to the well-known Wave Race 64, a classic on the N64 that also happened to be one of the first games produced for the system by none other than Shigeru Miyamoto. It originated as a simple tech demo that inevitably became what some consider to be the F-Zero of water, and it sold 1.95 million units in the US alone by the end of 2007 once it was released for the Wii's Virtual Console. The follow-up, Wave Race Blue Storm, was released in 2001 as a launch title for the GameCube. It was just as successful, although consumers were slightly bent out of shape when it came to the courses, which seemed to simply be reproductions of the ones in the previous game. However, it was given praise for its physics and added weather effects. All in all, the series was successful and is a staple of Nintendo's to date.
X. X is a 3D Game Boy based standalone title vehicular combat game that was only released in Japan. It features a wireframe view akin to Battlezone and is based on the Star Glider series, which was made by Argonaut Software, which ironically helped out with the making of X anyway. It was produced by innovator Gunpei Yokoi and saw one sequel, Xscape, in 2010. Alright, it's that time we talk about the big 3 franchises, the head honchos, the highest selling franchises that Nintendo has to offer. So let's get it started with number 3, The Legend of Zelda. Oh hell yeah, a Legend of motherfucking Zelda.
Wait, you're talking about Zelda?
I mean, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, my name is kind of inspired by a Zelda game. It's kind of a big deal.
Well, what about me? I'm literally 3 letters away from a landmark Zelda title.
Well, what do you suggest I do? Rock, paper, scissors for it?
That would be appropriate.
No, that's stupid. We're in a video.
Oh shit, we are. Huh. Wow, I wonder what the people watching are thinking about this dead air time.
I've got an idea. How about you, Fortefyre, talk about the retro games, I'll take the contemporary ones, and Marin covers the handhelds.
I can get behind that.
Yeah, alright, I'm down to clown. As long as it's not Kid Clown.
The Legend of Zelda was created by Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. It was inspired by Miyamoto's adventures in the forest as a child. The first game was released in 1986 for the Famicom Disk System, but soon saw a gold cartridge release on the NES. The game was definitely not linear, and consumers could do whatever they wanted in any order they wanted to. The sequel to the game would be released in 1987 and featured a massive increase in difficulty, as well as a different aesthetic paralleling a more RPG-based feel. Both of these games saw a massive success and became the foundation for the series as a whole. Jumping to the 16-bit era, A Link to the Past was again received with amazing reviews, resulting in 4.61 million units sold. This would be the only title released for the SNES though, well, commercially. The Satellaview that we talked about earlier was meant to allow for the continuation of the Zelda franchise for gung-ho gamers, but it failed miserably. But if you're curious, the 2 games were BS The Legend of Zelda and BS Zelda Inishi no Sekiban, the Stone Tablets. BS does not stand for bullshit, it stands for Broadcast Satellite. Soon the Nintendo 64 would be a thing, and with new technological advances, it was only a matter of time before Nintendo would hit the ground running to push a new game. The only issue is they didn't hit the ground running. They jumped from the other side of the galaxy, landed like a superhero, creating a blast radius that impacted time and space, and from the smoldering ashes of pure fucking awesomeness was a game called Ocarina of Time. It's my favorite game ever. Seriously. Ocarina of Time was a new direction for 3D gaming as compared to its competitors. The story, the music, the graphics, the emotions, everything was there, and people loved it. But yet again, Miyamoto wanted to expand the capabilities of the Nintendo 64, leading to the failed Zelda, or Another Zelda. It was meant to be on the Nintendo 64 disk drive, but despite the failure of the Double D, the game did see a Master Quest release and a 3DS re-release, both of which were highly successful. The final game to be released during the N64 era of gaming was Majora's Mask. It was a darker game that had many different elements, but it ultimately cannot be described over the course of this video. It was an experience like no other, with mechanics that were incredibly different than the previous games. Many love the game, and I happen to be one of them.
There's a trend for Zelda games, usually involving the unveiling of a new console. It seems that whenever a new console is released, there are games that by default have to be made. Traditionally, that means you'll always see a Zelda game, and you will almost always see a Mario game. This is what led to The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Both of these games had outstanding artwork and are considered legendary contributions to the franchise, boasting a massive following and ushering the franchise towards success on the Wii, where Twilight Princess was also given a reboot with different mechanics due to the Wiimote. In a survey among fans, people found that the GameCube version is a tad superior, but people respected both. Oh, by the way, Four Swords Adventures was also released between Wind Waker and Twilight Princess, and it's a funky game that has a multiplayer aspect to it. In 2004, it would be the third highest grossing game, and it used connectivity with the Game Boy Advance, which was really freaking nifty. After the release of Twilight Princess, the series seemed to have a quite significant shift in focus to the handheld market, where on the console market 5 years had already passed. In 2011, Nintendo finally released Skyward Sword, which was again another unique story and perspective on the overall franchise, and again garnering critical acclaim, but some didn't like it, given the cel-shaded artwork as well as heavy reliance on the Wii Motion Plus. In 2017, the most recent console entry and perhaps one of the most beautiful, immersive, expansive, and open-ended games to date, Breath of the Wild was released on the Nintendo Switch and Wii U, exceeding 8.48 million copies sold worldwide.
With all the attention and detail on the console market, it's important to remember that the handheld market had plenty of love from Shigeru Miyamoto. Zelda's first handheld game was released on the Game Boy, and it's my namesake with Little Miss Marin. Link's Awakening took place outside of Hyrule and excluded both Zelda and Ganon, a concept that many gamers wouldn't otherwise be exposed to until Majora's Mask, which takes place in Termina. The game was chock full of cameo references to other Nintendo IPs, and even the developers felt that the game was high-spirited, fun departure from the series. The game would receive an update called Link's Awakening DX, which was one of the first titles released for the new Game Boy Color. Like many games of the overall franchise, it was a recipient of many awards, and is often considered to be one of the greatest games in the overall library. The next entry in the series would be the Oracle games, which paralleled each other, maintaining the same art style as Link's Awakening. The Oracle games were supposed to be a 3-part series, but that idea was later scrapped. Capcom, of all people, developed it with their subsidiary Flagship, and each game sold 4 million copies respectively and maintained the same magic as the first handheld entry. Eventually, Capcom and Flagship would return to Hyrule with Minish Cap for GBA, which is a fairly whimsical game featuring a pint-sized race called Minish, and a battle style that allowed you to control Link and his 3 clones at the same time. Over the course of the next 8 years, Nintendo would release 4 more Zelda-based handheld games. Like we mentioned before, both Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask received great HD remakes on the 3DS, along with limited edition systems for each. The most recent installment was Triforce Heroes, a game that takes the multiplayer aspect of Four Swords Adventures and takes it online, using all sorts of wacky costumes to give Link various abilities. But much like many other companies and the Triforce, all that glitters is not gold. Earlier, we mentioned the failed partnership between Philips and Nintendo. Those games sucked. Like, really sucked. But before that, there were the LCD games. But those weren't necessarily bad, they just didn't take off as much as the others. But the CDI? Let's just say, between Faces of Evil and the Wand of Gamelon, I couldn't pick which one was better. Zelda's Adventure is at least somewhat playable, but in contemporary conversations, it's fair to say that these 3 games are not often considered remotely part of the universe, and are only enjoyed when it comes to making fun of them. 5 more Zelda-related spin-offs would be made, and the rest is history. Over the course of this legendary franchise, over 105 million units have been sold. Now all we need is a Link's Awakening remake. Nintendo, if you're listening to this, hook a girl up. Please.
The Wii series was born with the Wii, and it's no surprise that this franchise is so high up there because its sales figures are mostly due to the fact that every single one of these releases paralleled something important on the Wii itself, and usually they were bundled together. The first game, for example, Wii Sports, was bundled with the Wii and was a total demonstration on the capabilities of the Wiimote, and was Nintendo's answer to sports champions that PlayStation used with their PS3 Move controllers. It features boxing, tennis, bowling, golf, and baseball. Boxing obviously used the nunchucks. It sold an overall 82.85 million copies, again in part to it being bundled with the Wii itself. The sequel to the series was Wii Sports Resort, and much like the predecessor, Nintendo picked up on the concept that bundling the game with an accessory or console yields a positive response. The whole aim of Wii Sports Resort was to showcase the Wii Motion Plus edition that plugged in the bottom of the Wiimote. Eventually, the title would be bundled with the Wii, but initially it was only bundled with a modification. Wii Sports Club was released for the Wii U, and I've never played it, but it had all of the original sports from the first iteration, but instead used the Wii Motion Plus add-on to its full potential. Other spin-offs would be created to fit the brand, such as Wii Play, which had mini games such as table tennis and the shooting range, and because it was bundled with the extra Wiimote, it sold phenomenally, with 28.2 million units sold. The sequel, Wii Play Motion, was again bundled with the Wii Remote Plus and featured mini games developed by various software developers. One of my favorite spin-offs is the Wii Fit brand, which was a fitness-based series that used the Wii Balance Board, which, you guessed it, was bundled with the game. It engaged the audience and encouraged wellness, leading to it being the third highest-selling console game to not be bundled with the console. Much like all of the other Wii games, there was a Plus version and a Wii U release. As a sort of homage to the Mario Party series, Nintendo created a Wii Party spin-off that had a single release on the Wii as well as the Wii U. Other titles to be included in this line would be Wii Chess, Wii Music, Wii Street U, as well as Wii U Panorama View. With all the games accounting for regional variations, a total of 203.15 million units were sold. Mario! Well, what do you think was going to be number one? This guy has been the poster child for Nintendo since 1987 and has been a major staple in the homes of tons of kids in the 80s, 90s, and even in the contemporary spectrum. Why? Because this universe is simply massive. From the early days of Mario all the way to contemporary releases, the Mario IP has been the guinea pig for whatever concepts that Shigeru Miyamoto wanted. For example, sports, party games, and even racing. Because of this, there are a significant number of games, whether they be main series, co-integrated character games, or third-party releases. Due to this fact, we will not be covering every single game in the context of how we usually do things around here. Because we here at the Ready Go Gaming Show team fervently believe that the Mario universe shouldn't be compressed down to a single tiny segment. Mario will be the first episode we do that explores individual games' universe. And we know just the person to lead the charge. But anyway, we do want to talk about some of the games, so let's get started with the main series titles.
Did you know that in the beginning of Mario's career, he wasn't even known as Mario? He was known as Jumpman, but I'm sure everyone knows that. The first game to have this appearance of Jumpman would be Donkey Kong in the arcades, which would see tons of releases on various platforms from the Intellivision all the way to the Game Boy Advance, hitting the Intellivision, IBM PC Booter, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, and the Atari 2600 to include 9 other key systems from the 80s to the early 90s. The game was a massive success and led to a huge cultural wave from TV shows to books and way more. The game yielded a revenue of $280 million when it was released. In 2018, this would amount to $754 million. Incredible, huh? Jumpman would be referred to as Mario with the 1982 game Donkey Kong Jr. The Donkey Kong line would continue to be a separate branch, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to jump over to the main Mario franchise. And yes, we know that Mario Bros. Is a game. Don't worry, we'll cover all the fine-tuning in future episodes.
The first main series to truly involve Mario in a large capacity was the NES release of Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom. It featured Mario, and if you had a player 2, then you could play as Luigi going to save the princess from the evil Koopa King, Bowser. The original version sold over 42.24 million copies, meaning that it was the best-selling Mario game in the series and one of the best-selling video games of all time. The game was simple platforming that got progressively more difficult, it had catchy music, and overall it was pretty badass. The next game was released in 1986 and was called Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, well, everywhere else. In Japan, where it was exclusively released, it was simply called Super Mario Bros. 2. Us North American folk got something different. But we'll get there in a second. Super Mario Bros. 2, Japanese style, was a ridiculously difficult game, but people loved it on the disc system. Now in the US, we got a version of Super Mario 2, but it's kind of doo-doo. Why? Because we received a retrofitted version of the game called Doki Doki Panic, another Famicom disc system game, but that doesn't mean that the game was bad. I know I called it poo-poo, but it's not really that bad. In fact, it sold 10 million copies, and Nintendo Power considered it the 8th best NES game in their 231st volume of their publication. The next major release would be Super Mario 3, which is personally my favorite NES and Mario game ever. It follows the same plot progression with some minor changes, and is simply fantastic. It was featured in The Wizard, which was a plan by Nintendo to sort of preview the game, generating tons of public hype about the game, and it was a huge success, topping numerous lists of best evers, and in my personal opinion was the best representation of what the hardware on the NES was capable of doing. Hands down.
The jump to the SNES was relatively expected. After all, why would you stop acting on a franchise that brought you so much success? Luckily, Nintendo as a company was fairly keen on how they wanted to advertise, and to what demographic they want to advertise to, so because of this, they very rarely screwed the pooch in terms of what they released officially. Basically what I'm saying is that Nintendo knew their next entry needed to make sure that the Super Nintendo was hitting the ground running. And boy howdy didn't they. Super Mario World is literally one of the greatest games created of all time. It sold 20 million copies, making it the highest selling SNES game, and was met with landmark response. The game was crisp, the music was phenomenal, the art was vibrant. I literally just can't even. It's just too good. The game has seen many re-releases, even being bundled with Super Mario All-Stars, as well as getting a revision on the Game Boy Advance. The next major release to be created was Super Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64. As a launch title, people loved the game. The concept again was simple. You were playing as Mario on a quest to save the princess from the evil Bowser, jumping into worlds through portraits to combat the evil entities that Bowser had created. For the most part, a lot of the concepts, enemies, and characters to some capacity were recycled, but there were plenty of new enemies too. It retained all the magic of the previous releases combined. People loved it, and it sold around 11 million copies. The complexity of the worlds showed that in a 3D rendered environment, Mario could still lead the charge for this powerhouse company. The only downfall was the camera.
There wouldn't be another standalone N64 Mario title in the main series, due in part to the failure of the DD expansion on which Miyamoto was planning the sequel to Super Mario 64. But when it comes to Nintendo, you can always count on a new Mario game with every new console, kind of like Zelda. For the GameCube, Nintendo released Super Mario Sunshine. It kept the mechanic of finding stars, or in this case, shines, and to be honest, that would become a trope within the Mario universe. This game was super unique in one aspect, the flood system. The flood system stood for Flash Liquidizing Ultra Dousing Device and was a high-powered cannon of water that could be used to clean up the toxic sludge on Isle Delphine, but it had other uses as well. In fact, the flood system ultimately drives the game's motion mechanics as well when it comes to many of the puzzles in the game. Ironically, given the popularity of this game, it wasn't nearly as successful as the predecessors. But hey, at least it crushed the launch titles of Xbox and PS2, right? Cough cough, looking at you, Halo and Grand Theft Auto 3. Despite not living up to company expectations, that wouldn't stop Nintendo. With the new system comes new technological abilities, and with the Wii, the possibilities at the time seemed endless. But Nintendo had to put their nose to the grindstone. They considered exactly what issues people had in the past with other Nintendo games, and for the most part they were all similar. 1. The camera, 2. The controls, and 3. The mechanics. Many people felt the camera was almost too static and that it took away from the gameplay. The controls sometimes resulted in Mario doing some pretty wonky maneuvers in the older games, and the mechanics needed to be revamped to where it was a fresh, nice story that could lasso in a new generation of gamers. Nintendo translated those complaints into visions of hope to create the next big Mario game, called Super Mario Galaxy. Super Mario Galaxy is a masterpiece in the series and allowed for Mario to run around planets each with their own varying degree of gravity, meeting cool characters along the way. It received a direct sequel 3 years later. Between the release of the Galaxy games, New Super Mario Bros. Wii was created. This resulted in a few more games in that particular branch, but for the most part the Mario series was somewhat quiet, creating fun multiplayer games such as 3D World, New Super Mario Bros. U, and Mario Maker.
It wasn't until the release of the Nintendo Switch that the piece of gold from Jesus, of the Christ, of the sacred, of the mankind, of the Mars, of the eternity of life as we know it, came down and was presented in the form of Mario Odyssey. Holy crap. Good job, Nintendo. This game is beautiful, and it felt like it was a completely new idea mechanics-wise. Sure, you had to save the princess, but that's a trope that will always remain in the series. As of now, Odyssey has sold roughly 10 million copies. The game just feels great.
Like mentioned before, there are a lot of branches from the central Mario series due in part to a lot of the characters in the universe. For example, Mario himself has appeared in over 200 games, from adventure games to RPGs to sports games and even hotel games, unfortunately. Anyway, individuals such as Donkey Kong would have a rather large series, Yoshi would have some rather frustrating games, Wario was always up to his own antics over numerous titles, and even Toad would go on to have his own adventures. Like we said, we will create a Mario Universe episode that will cover everything from the original days on the NES all the way to contemporary with everything in between. But what we want to share with you right now is that as of today, over 823.34 million units of the Mario series games have been sold.
Well, that's it for today's episode. I hope you really enjoyed what you saw today. Like I said, we had a lot of awesome people come together to make this happen. Next episode is going to be about the fighting genre, from start to finish, all the way from retro, all the way to contemporary. And we got two awesome people who are going to be speaking on that, Sarconius, as well as Guttural Steve. Both of them are great members of the retro community, just like everybody else that we've had in the show. Awesome people who take the time to help out with these videos, and I greatly appreciate it. So that's it for me for today. My name is Fortefyre, BreathoftheLyle, YougotMarin. Thank you so much for helping on this video. Until next time, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.